Hey guys, welcome, welcome. This is Medusa was Framed. My name is Joyce, and today I'm going to talk to you about yet another reset architect, as I call them, that I learned about here in my lovely St. Augustine, Florida. Today we're going to talk about Franklin Webster Smith, a man you may have heard about in different contexts, the man who drafted plans to rebuild Washington, D.C. It's probably what he is most known for. But if you are familiar with my city here, St. Augustine, then you recognize this building right here, the Via Zarada, which sits on King Street, across the street from the current Flagler College, once the Ponce de Leon Hotel. Franklin Webster Smith is the man attributed with building this home and the Casa Monica Hotel. A lot of finding went on. A lot of finding during this time. Anyway, before we proceed with that, I just want to give props to my friends Melanie, Michelle, and Buffy at Unguru. I am now part of an ensemble of researchers, educators, and entrepreneurs poised to help this transition to sovereignty in a wide variety of digital educational needs. You can find out more about Unguru at ungurulife.com. I will soon be offering courses there in magnetic therapy, as well as joining in the fireside chat interview system, thanks to Michelle Gibson. So let us proceed with today's shill. Franklin Webster Smith was born 1826 in Boston. Born into a family of influence. Isn't that a common theme with these guys? They're born into influence. His father was a tax collector for the Port of Boston and a notable Freemason. That's another common theme too. If you remember my video about the Frere family of architects from New Orleans, then you may recall that Frere Sr. was also the tax collector for the Port of New Orleans. Interesting. His paternal grandfather, Mr. Smith's paternal grandfather, was at one time the president of Harvard. Skull and bones. So Franklin's tendency toward building models and designing and putting things together and wanting to know how things work were cultivated in his childhood, and he was placed around people that he could learn significant things from. It was cultivated. He was in a wealthy family. They could afford to hire people to teach him how to build things and this and that. His influence and wealth from this notable family also allowed him to travel and learn. So I guess he was pretty good at his Legos. Pretty gosh dang good. Because in 1844, at the tender age of 18, this hoo-ha right here, as the story goes, took part in the Paris exhibition. An 18-year-old taking part in what you'd call the Paris World's Fair. As an exhibitor. he had examples of knife and fork sets and auger bits in essentially the mechanics building. Oh, I should have. Sorry about that. I should have advanced that. This is just a cool early drawing of the Port of Boston in reference to Mr. Smith's pop. Sorry about that. I didn't advance that properly. But here we go. This is a rendering of the Paris exhibition, at least one of the buildings of the Paris exhibition, another found building indeed. So at the tender age of 18 in 1844, Franklin was here, at least in one of the buildings. I'm not sure which building this is or was, offering examples of elaborate knife and fork sets and auger bits. In the 1840s. Let's see, I guess from Boston to Paris then would have been what? A 3-month journey in a ship? Well, fortunately, knife and forks and auger bits don't take up a lot of storage, so I guess he could have made that journey. So he came back and he was all fired up, all fired up. And he started a hardware business in Boston with his brother. And that was very successful. So successful that in 1851, at the still tender age of 25, guess where he was next? At the London exhibition. Oh my God. In essentially, again, what you would call the halls of industry. Whoop, I went too far. We'll stay right here for a second. Yeah. So you recognize this as a Crystal Palace and from the London exhibition. And that's a whole other story, you know, of finding and reset architects. The guy who was attributed with building the Crystal Palace is probably the biggest shill of them all. And I can't even remember his name now, honestly, but he's supposed to have built this thing, a guy who's not even a trained architect. He was a cabinet maker or something. And he was supposed to build this when he was like 23, the Crystal Palace. Yeah. Sure. So that went really well too. Man, he's 25 and he's already worked in Paris and worked in London. And he had his own business. It pays to have Mason, Skull and Bones, family connections, I guess. So when he got back from the London exhibition, he was already well established in Boston as a businessman. And obviously he had Masonic family connections which helped him. But he was asked to help organize basically what became the YMCA, the Boston Young Men's Christians Association. Now, at the time, he was the Sunday school superintendent for his Baptist church, which was housed in this splendid building right here, referred to as the Tremont Temple. Isn't that magnificent? Now, this was really interesting at the time. This building, we're told, was not built as a church, actually. It was built as a theater. And it was opened as a theater, as the Tremont Theater in 1827. The Boston Baptist Church apparently bought it or what would become the Boston Baptist Church, in December of 1843 and turned it into the Free Baptist Church of Boston. Well, that's another thing. And I just learned about this. I didn't know this. Apparently, churches back then, well, let me start over. You know how you go to church and they pass the offering plate? Okay. Well, apparently they didn't pass the offering plate back then. There was like you'd pay for a pew. You'd pay for your rights to sit in the pew. And then you could invite whoever you wanted to sit in the pew. And then there would be pews that you would pay to sit in, like you'd pay for your spot. Well, this church opened up under the premise of being a free church. So they had subscriptions to pew space, which the wealthy would continue to do and did so. But they made it inviting for the poor, for immigrants, or for people who were just curious to come in and check it out. So they were listed as a free church at the time, which was very appealing, especially since it was originally a theater with a grand pipe organ that could seat over 1,800 people. Yeah, so they were free. Now, this church burned 3 times. Fires are so convenient. The first fire apparently was in 1852, then again in 1879 and 1893. Looks masonry to me. Doesn't it to you? How do you burn masonry? I think we've asked that question before. I don't know how you burn masonry. Anyway, dear little Frankie, you know, I really like to be diminutive with these guys. Dear little Frankie, who was not a trained architect, but was trained at an early age to use his hands and build things. So he liked to build models. So after that 1852 fire, he was consulted, we are told, in the reconstruction because he was an architectural enthusiast and because he had already been to such grandiose places and learned so much about architectural styles. They were pretty impressed with him. So now another interesting thing about this building, because it wasn't built as a church, it was built as a theater, is that it was multi-use. So even when it was a church, as this is a contemporary picture, and still to this day, it's multi-use. So the ground floor was devoted to businesses and the upper floors for offices. So that being part of how the church could afford to be free for folks. One of the most notable things about the Tremont Temple is at one point it was used to display a mummy in September of 1850. All this time, because of the size of the theater portion, the worship center, they would allow it to be used, rented out, leased out, what have you, for operas, plays, different kinds of concerts and lectures, and showings, as in this case, a cultural showing of an Egyptian mummy, which, if I read correctly, little Frankie, again, had something to do with. And that's a whole other strange, scandalous, made up story. Oh boy, I don't know when this was taken. We can kind of get a gauge from those handsome cabs down there, but if you've been to Boston, you know what a majestic city it is. Look at all those finials. Look at all of that. Pretty spectacular. I haven't been I was in Boston twice when I lived in DC. I haven't been back since. And I may well have walked past this building, but I don't recall, unfortunately, because there is so much in Boston that is grand. Look at that. All right. So there's the inside. Check it out. Check it out. Now, on a side note, as I said, the organ came with the building when the Baptists built it. And the organ is said to have been built by the pipe organ designers of E. and G.G. Hook of Boston, that being Elias and George Greenleaf Hook, who had studied with the organ builder William Goodrich, who was the most notable organ builder, excuse me, at the time. The Hook brothers were sons of, you guessed it, you're going to hear this over and over again, cabinet maker, sons of a cabinet maker, trained as cabinet makers. Cabinet makers. How do cabinet makers learn to form steel? I don't know. Anyway, they went to apprentice with William Goodrich in Salem. And then I guess they got good and they built a couple good organs that were pleasing, and they decided to come back to Boston and start their own business. And they did in 1832, because they wanted to produce bigger organs than they had been producing for Master Goodrich. And this, supposedly installed in 1841, was the first concert hall organ in Massachusetts. Interestingly enough, I was looking into that a little bit more. Sorry, that's a pretty dark picture. And though the pipes are still here, the organ is still played, but it's hooked up to a digital system now. Too bad, can't read all that. Interesting mosaics. You might remember from my video about Richard Upjohn, the Shill Episcopalian cabinet maker, church builder, who helped create the American Institute of Architects, which we'll talk about a little bit later today, but also was part of a big Episcopalian Shill group that ended up in, he, the builder, along with another gentleman who was a muralist and another gentleman who was a stained glass artist, to be the predominant authorities in those crafts in the Episcopalian world, and even have their own feast day. So ridiculous. So though I did not go into any detail at all about the muralist here, of course, it makes me think that a similar story, look at those resonators, a similar story is most likely involved here. All that gold, right? So Upjohn took care of the whole Episcopalian angle, right? So we've got little Frankie here running the gamut on the Baptist angle? I don't know. Maybe this guy is one of those guys. Hey, I don't know. But we know about pipe organs and resonators and stone and columns. Little detail there of the Tremont Temple. That's about halfway up the front of the building, if you recall. Pretty spectacular. Also, a cool thing that happened here is that this was the site of Charles Dickens' first American readings of his books. There was a 2-hour presentation in December of 1867, and he read from Pickwick Papers and A Christmas Carol. There were film screenings, operas, and after the last fire in 1893, apparently they increased retail space. So anyway, besides the fact that he was the superintendent of Sunday schools, being a moral man and all those good things, because of his influence in other ways, he was asked, as I mentioned before, to help this group that were trying to create more of a formal organization, the Young Men's Christian Association in Boston, the BYMCA. So he used his access to the Tremont Temple and his associations with other vendors and the city council and whatnot to put together a plan for a huge bazaar, a bazaar that would be a fundraiser that would help the YMCA, it wasn't called that yet, get into a building and set up shop. So he put together this Bazaar of Nations. This Bazaar of Nations that would be poised in the temple and on the ground around. Being a builder of models, he was excited with the opportunity to create things on the streets, redo the facades of buildings. So in 1851, he put together his first Bazaar of Nations. He recreated Jerusalem's Damascus Gate, refacaded a building to look like a 3-story Alpine German home, refacaded a building to look like a French house, managed to use a canal in Boston, in the area, of course there are lots of canals in Boston, and refacaded the buildings there to resemble Venice and an old English home. Also a Turkish house, a Swiss chalet, and a Chinese pavilion. Around all of these refacaded homes were individuals dressed up appropriately to the culture, who were supposedly scripted to give you information about their cultures. There was a band dressed in Bavarian attire with lederhosen and all of that good stuff, traveling around with lines of individuals also in costumes. Apparently there were people dressed up as traditional Russians, Swedes, French, Gaelic, German, Arab, Hawaiian, and Chinese. They were all just dressed up that way. There were Swiss guards in chainmail, Syrian warriors, and Bedouins. He had created a tower, a Muslim tower, in one of the neighboring buildings and had a muezzin singing and calling to prayer. And people paid to come and immerse themselves in this culture and buy tchotchkes and hack type souvenirs and crafts and such, because people who had wares to sell came and set up. And it was very successful. And he raised money for the YMCA to get established. Now, this is not the original YMCA building. The original YMCA building that he is responsible, we are said, for them getting into burned. Oh gosh, all these wonderful fires. Yeah. This too is a pretty spectacular building, but actually the original building, if the images that I saw are correct, was more spectacular. It had a bell tower and all kinds of lovely things. Now, he was a humble man, right? Yeah, we know. We know he was a humble dude. This was so successful, what he did in Boston for the YMCA. He thought, gosh, I can take this on the road because we made a lot of money and people ate it up. So we are to believe that he then participated in the International Exhibition of Art, Manufacturing, and Products of Soil and Mine, or the Philadelphia World's Fair, or the Philadelphia Exhibition in 1875, for which there were coins minted. And he did the same thing, we're told, on a grander scale. The World's Fair in Philly drew a lot of crowds, but is listed as a financial failure, unfortunately. Being a centennial exposition of the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It was in Fairmount Park, which was, and I don't remember if it still is, but was at the time situated on both sides of the Schuylkill. They list 10 million visitors, May to November of 1876. Prior to that, there had been a sanitary fair there, 1864. And I think that's where Frankie got the idea to participate. Funny, right? Yeah. Raise money for the YMCA in Philly. Interesting how all these people have access to all this money and all these connections. And a lot of people are living in squalor. So, because he was a humble fellow, oh, so humble, he shot for Chicago next. Let's take this to the White City, which hadn't been built yet. Though apparently he knew some of the guys. Apparently he already knew Olmsted. And let's do a Bazaar of Nations in Chicago at the White City. They didn't want him. But we're supposed to believe that he was still consulted by the architectural team, Berman, and I can't remember the rest of them, Burnham, the head honcho hack. But he had already developed a relationship with Olmsted, and the conversations about his potential participation in the Chicago World's Fair solidified his relationship with Olmsted. He used Olmsted later, we are to believe, in stuff he did in DC. Though he didn't get into the Chicago World's Fair, the story goes that all of a sudden, Bazaar of Nations started popping up all over the Northeast, imitations of his grand design. In buildings that were already there. So after Philly, he returned back home and started really building models in earnest. He thought, wow, I really turned this around. I got the YMCA going. Everybody loved it. Philly, they loved it, but it wasn't successful financially. So he's running his business with his brother back in Boston. And he's building models like crazy. And because there was this war going on. Wait a minute. So we've got sanitary fairs. We've got World's Fairs going on. We've got Philly, eventually we had Chicago, New York. During a war? During the Civil War? What? That was built during the Civil War? That's what you're supposed to believe. Now remember, his business was hardware. So you can imagine that a hardware contractor during the Civil War probably did pretty well in a naval city of Boston, right? Stands to reason. But now he came from a religious family. He was involved in his church, superintendent of Sunday school, and now he was the president of the YMCA, which is a Christian organization. He had also by this time married his lovely wife, Laura Bevan, who came from an influential Quaker family from Baltimore. So he was at the heart of Reformation. He was a vocal, published abolitionist, suffragist, and general, I suppose, shall we say, trying to be a positive influence of morality. And he learned in his dealings with the Navy that there was a lot of corruption. Some contractors always got the bid, but there seemed to be a lot of graft and money moving into pockets it probably shouldn't have moved into. And his grandiosity and sense for moral righteousness as the philanthropic reformer that he was resulted in him putting together a pamphlet, not the first and not the last, of his findings in sanctimonious form, which, by the way, you can still read if you have the stomach for it, of dealt with the corruption in the Navy contracting system, naming names all the way up to the Secretary of the Navy. Now, of course, he was a successful businessman, and he was skull and bones and all of that good stuff. So he had connections in Congress. Of course he did. He printed copies of his presentation of the corruption of the Department of the Navy and civilian contracts, and passed it to his congressional friends to pass in committee at Congress. Well, they paid attention, we are led to believe. They paid attention and decided in 1864 to form a Senate committee investigating contract fraud. And that hearings lasted 4 months. And all of Smith's accusations appeared to have been confirmed. So January, February, March, April, 4 months of hearings. April, May-ish is when the trial ended, but they had not yet released their findings. Now, in the meantime, the Navy was not very pleased with this. They were not pleased with the naming of names, and certainly not with someone who had made so much money off of their contracts to be squealing on them. So they went after him. The findings of his congressional hearing were supposed to be made public in June, the trial ending in April or May. So in that period of time between the trial ending and the results being released, his business was tossed. His staff were packed up, thrown in a paddy wagon, and put in jail. He and his brother were restrained, escorted by Marines on a boat to here, to Fort Warren. Oh, and all the papers of all his business, all his models thus far, everything was confiscated and vanished. After the fact, they vanished. Didn't vanish right away, but they were never to be seen again, we are told. Kind of like, gosh, there's so many cases of that, of all these reset architects and their grandiose plans, and something happens. There's a theft, there's a fire, all their architectural drawings, all their proof is gone. Anyway, so his staff spent the night in jail, were questioned the next day, and then released. The Smith brothers stayed at Fort Warren for some time. Now realize no warrants were ever issued for this action. The Navy just used their strong hand. How dare a skull and boneser betray the brotherhood, right? When the family tried to inquire about bail, they were told the equivalent of $1 million in today's money. But His congressional friends managed to raise the money and bailed them out in 2 days. They raised the equivalent of $1 million in 2 days. Interesting. Well, okay. The business was gone. It was closed. Can't run a business when all your paperwork's gone. Staff was released, but didn't mean much. Smith just went home to his wife and 3 kids and tried to make sense out of things. Shortly after, he was summoned to a court-martial. So one of the things that had come from this congressional action into the dishonesty of civil contractors with the Navy was making it so that if you were a civilian contractor dealing with the military, in this case specifically the Navy, and you were found guilty of corruption or fraud, your collaboration with the Navy, especially during wartime, made you a member of the military and therefore subject to court-martial. And so Smith alone, just Big Brother Smith, not Little Brother Smith, he just kind of vanished into oblivion at that point. Had to sit for court-martial. Interesting, right? Well, now, Smith's congressional contracts started lobbying for his support. And Smith had also been an active part of the forming, basically, of the Republican Party in Boston at the time, and is said to have worked on Lincoln's campaign and knew Lincoln personally. So he had an ace in the hole at this point. So he and his congressional supporters petitioned Lincoln to step in and make this all go away. Story goes that Lincoln, being a lawyer, said, no, we have to let the trial proceed. But then I will read the transcripts before they cast their sentence, and we'll see what happens. So the trial went on. Smith had to go to Philly for this court-martial. It also is supposed to have gone on for 4 exhausting months. And when it was over, all the transcripts were given to Lincoln and his team. And ultimately, Lincoln pardoned Smith. So nothing came of that, but he had been destroyed. And it was a month later, interestingly enough, that Lincoln was dead, but one had nothing to do with the other, at least, I don't think. So now what? His name's been ruined, even though he'd been pardoned by Lincoln, it didn't matter. His name had been ruined. His business in Boston was ruined in all intents and purposes. His reputation had been ruined. Well, there were also, the country was dealing with a depression too. More than one run on the bank. People were being laid off in factories, railroads were going belly up. There was a lot of that going on. So his wife's Quaker influence apparently had a lot of influence on him, already being Baptist, reformer, cough, cough. You know, I totally believe all that philanthropic reformer stuff is part of the reset design. But anyway, he saw different ways to make money using, I think, the Shill approach of reformation, redistribution of land, philanthropy. So he got involved in a group called the Boston Board of Aid to Land Ownership, a group that saw a potential use of undeveloped land in undeveloped portions of the nation to build utopian communes. This reminds me of another video I did about a utopia that failed. Anyway, needless to say, little Frankie was soon elected president of the group and started researching sustainable community potential. So there had been something going on, a big mess had been going on in the Cumberland Gap area of Tennessee and the Appalachians. There was a lot of upheaval there because all the railroads were failing. So one reason or another, he ended up there, snooping around in the Cumberland Gap area. And he found what he thought was the perfect place. He called the place Plateau City on his original plans. But it was very, very tumultuous. The New York Stock Exchange had actually closed for 10 days during this time. The factories were laying off workers and closing. Railroads left and right were declaring bankruptcy. And so in 1879, there needed to be a monetary reorganization within the board. And they brought in British investors. Well, the British investors took the majority. So Frankie being president didn't mean much anymore. They reworked the plan and decided to call the establishment Rugby. Rugby, the colony, the community, whatever you want to call it, supposedly opened in October of 1880. Now, Smith's plan had called for wealthy landowners to buy tracts of land and subdivide accordingly to then supply settlers with a home or the seed money to build their own home, farm implements, seeds, provisions, and then just charge them very minimal interest. Smith hoped to include a library, a college, a church, 3 general stores, a drugstore, a hotel, office and hardware to create a weekly newspaper, telephones installed in every home, well-developed trails, and a sanitarium, because he saw the potential to convert this redistribution community into a resort for wealthy invalids. These people. Rugby was started by 20 families. The town peaked at 300, but it never became a destination because the majority of the board had moved more toward simply establishing a community instead of being a resort. And Smith stepped away once the community started developing. There was a fire in 1900. Oh my goodness, really? Another fire? That destroyed the community. All that's left are a few homes and a church. Frankie was hitting a lot of bad luck. A lot of bad luck. So that didn't go very well. So Smith had in his life spent time on and off in St. Augustine, my lovely St. Augustine, Florida, because his wife's family had a home here. Those influential, wealthy Quakers. He found it fascinating, full of potential, realizing that back in those days, most of it was cypress swamp and sandy pine runs, pretty much inhabitable. I mean, the city that I live in was a big swamp at the time. But it was all of this potential that was attracting many people, notable at the time. Now, Frankie went back because he had a home that he could stay in, his wife's, one of their winter homes. This is one of the dudes that was called to St. Augustine for reset reasons, shall we say. This is James Renwick Jr. who we are told was commissioned by the greatest shill of all time, Henry Flagler, to build the bell tower at the St. Augustine Cathedral. And some of you will recognize that as behind it as the 24 Treasury building that I did a video on, which sits right next to the cathedral. So Renwick was in town at the behest of Flagler, the shill, to build the bell tower after a fire. There were 3 main fires in St. Augustine that I can find. Construction. Another person, important person, was tobacco baron George Lollayard, and I probably said that wrong, who had a home here. He's the man who developed Newports. So there was some stuff going on. St. Augustine was a very small community. The walls at the time, the city, well, when the walls came down after colonial period, there were still the moats that had run around the city. All those moats now have become streets that demarcate the old borders of St. Augustine, but it was still, the city of St. Augustine was still a small place. Not many blocks long or wide, because it was swampy, creaky. Just a point of reference, and then I'll move on from this. James Renwick Jr., who we are to believe Flagler commissioned to build the bell tower, also not a trained architect, a fan of the Beaux Arts movement, but not studied in the Beaux Arts movement, simply the son of an architect. Also is supposed to have built this. The castle, the Smithsonian Castle in DC. Yeah, sure he did. Now, during this time, there were big hotels in St. Augustine, but they weren't grand. They weren't elaborate. They were big. Of course, they were found Moorish, Tartarian, Hyperborean buildings. But they weren't grand. They weren't opulent. There were hotels, though. This was one. This was the St. George. This was the main Mac Daddy. This was the San Marco Hotel. This stood at what now is the Visitor Center across the street from the Castillo San Marcos. This was the Mac Daddy. This was the main hotel. They had tennis courts, golf courses, they had a spa, they had running water, they had Turkish baths, all sorts of stuff. Nice find, right? Pretty spectacular. There's also a hotel that sat at the corner of King Street and the Matanzas River that was known as the St. Augustine Hotel. So there was stuff going on here. Oops, I went too far. There was stuff going on here, but mostly it was potential. During the summer, not much went on here beyond fishing, but during the winter, which is when all of those hotels were open, people from the north and the east came down to winter in mild St. Augustine. So Smith's in-laws already had a home here. He had been so impressed with what he saw in Spain and the Mediterranean and North Africa that he decided that he wanted a Moorish home. He wanted a Moorish home influenced by the Alhambra. So we are to believe that he used the local connections and influence of his very wealthy, well-to-do Quaker in-law family, since he had been destroyed in the court-martial, to purchase the land here on King Street and build this, his home. In 1885, we are to believe that his Via Zarada opened. It's still called the Via Zarada, by the way. He contacted one of his contractor friends back in Boston to come down to St. Augustine and try something that he had learned about when he was traveling through North Africa. And that was blending concrete with sand and molding it into form to build temples that basically became stone. So he thought to use the miracle product of St. Augustine, coquina, the shell limestone that the Castillo San Marcos, all of the city walls and gates, and many of the still existing buildings in old colonial St. Augustine were made out of. The shell limestone that was harvested at no easy task from the shores or swampland around Anastasia Island. So this became their home, one of their homes. Pretty snazzy, right? I wish it still looked like that. I wish it was all overgrown like that. It doesn't look like that. There's trees and all kinds of stuff now, but that wall is still there. So he's trying to start over, build a new life. Now, there's property on the other side of it, to the east of here, that he was able to purchase with a doctor friend of his that he had made Also, all his St. Augustine connections were based on what had already been established by his in-laws, the Bevans. So he and this doctor purchased land right next to that home, and also across what was the street. It's still a street, further east, the next block. So he's living here. He's trying to figure out what's he going to do, building models, being spectacular, being grandiose. But then who comes down for his third trip to St. Augustine? You know it. You know who. You know who. The biggest shill on the East Coast, Henry Flagler, came back down once again to visit St. Augustine. And he saw the Via Zarata. None of this, we are told, was here yet. This was all just dirt. Nothing was here. Via Zarata is like right here in reference to this map, and that's the Matanzas River. So he came down. He had been coming down, Standard Oil, Rockefeller money, shill. He'd been coming down, trying to figure out, there's so much potential here. What can we do here? So much potential. We got to make this. There's already a movement of people from the Northeast down here to winter. He was absolutely positive that he could find a way to corner the market and turn it into the Riviera of Florida. So he comes back and he's walking on King Street, or he's riding on a hansom cab on King Street, I don't know which. And he sees the Via Zarata, which had not been there, we're told, ha ha, last time he was down. And he sought out Franklin Smith. Hey man, you want to sell your house? Laura wouldn't let him, story goes. Laura wouldn't sell. But Flagler was so intrigued with the building and how the building looked, not only in style, but also in construction. The whole poured concrete thing really fascinated him. So anyway, you know, shills appreciate each other, right? So they started a collaboration. They started talking. And they came up with a plan to build hotels together and turn St. Augustine into that American Riviera. So let me just give you some reference here. The Via Zarata is like, well, actually it's off the screen. This is the Alhambra Hotel, which Smith later built, which is not there anymore. It burned down. This is the Hotel Alcazar. It's now referred to as the Leitner Museum. This was a Flagler property. This is part of the Ponce de Leon Hotel, which was, and which is now Flagler College. This is the Casa Monica, which was Smith's first hotel. These three are all still here, though that smokestack is gone. So both Smith and Flagler started plans to build their grandiose hotels. And we are told that Smith helped train Flagler's masons on the mixing of concrete with coquina plan to pour these buildings, being much cheaper and easier in labor, expense, and time than wood or standard stone mason work. Flagler hired the Beaux Arts trained business of Carrere and Hastings, who, cough, cough, went on to build the New York Public Library, cough, cough, as well as his home in West Palm Beach, when she unified the railroads, and we are to believe established the grandeur that was West Palm Beach at the time. I find it interesting, again, hearkening on another video that I did. Hastings. Okay. There was a gentleman by the name of Thomas Hastings, who was Flagler's cousin, who was set to a tract of land west of St. Augustine once the Ponce de Leon Hotel was open. And he was set to be the producer of all of the vegetables, especially the winter vegetables for the Ponce de Leon Hotel and Alcazar hotels. His name was Thomas Hastings. Okay, that's a common name. Well, the Hastings of Carrere and Hastings was also a Thomas Hastings. So I don't know. I just notice these things, and you know how it's all made up, and people tend to keep things in the family. Anyway, together, Smith and Flagler produced pamphlets, which Smith was already good at. He had been producing a lot of pamphlets before that, both to bring attention to the corruption in the Navy, but before that, also to advertise all his bazaar endeavors, his World Bazaar, World Fair exhibition endeavors. So he was a good pamphleteer hack. So together they produced all these pamphlets to advertise to the Northeast this new Riviera that they were building. Another shot of the Visorata. It looks like this now. It has been maintained and restored. So the Ponce de Leon Hotel opened January 13th, 1888 with 540 rooms. That's the big Flagler Hotel. The Alcazar across the street opened in 1889. Smith's Hotel, the Casa Monica, which is over here, also opened in 1888 with 138 rooms and 14 suites. Now, interestingly enough, Smith was having a hard time with money. He didn't really have the money to do what he had done. Apparently, there was a lot of bank involvement and the kindness of strangers and his in-laws. So if you can imagine this grandiose hotel, both being Flagler properties, and then another grandiose hotel here in a city that had at least 3 other big hotels. They weren't grand and opulent, but they were big. There's only so many people. I mean, really, guys. And what these two wanted to do with these 3 hotels was to bring the greatness of Europe. And if you've been inside the Ponce de Leon Hotel or the old Alcazar or the Casa Monica for that matter, you see all that grandeur, unnecessarily ridiculous opulence. So the Casa Monica Freddie's Hotel, also opened in 1888, same time that the Ponce de Leon opened. But at the end of the season of 1888 in May, he was in trouble. Frankie was in trouble, and so he sold it to Flagler. So now Flagler owned the 3 grand hotels on King Street, which was a couple blocks from the railroad station and the river. Well, apparently, that was a real blow to his ego, Frankie. He wanted a hotel. He just realized that he couldn't have a grand hotel. So he used the property that he had, which was next to his house. This is a Via Zarata. He had purchased this property, remember I told you, with a doctor friend colleague in St. Augustine. And they decided to build another hotel that was a little more modest. That became known as the Granada. At some point, it was known as the Alhambra. So another hotel in a city that really didn't need another hotel. But apparently this worked a little better for him. And his kids were happy. His son, William, apparently set up tennis pros and tennis lessons in the courts behind the Alcazar back here, and ran boat rides from the foot of King Street across the Matanzas River over to, this is Anastasia Island over here, which is very developed now, but at the time there was nothing there, just a few houses and a lighthouse. So he ran boat rides over across the Matanzas, out through the Salt Run, over to the old lighthouse. And his daughter, Nina, played hotel owner's daughter and kept track of all the comings and the goings of the resort crowd, and ultimately wrote a book called Tales of St. Augustine. So he'd sold the Casa Monica to Flagler, who then called it the Cordova. He had reestablished his ego in a smaller, less grand hotel, the Granada, later known as the Alhambra. And he was feeling a little more egotistically stable. Well, he had constantly been building models because he's just that kind of guy. He is full of grandeur. And he wanted to build a reconstruction of a temple from Pompeii. He'd read a book called The Last Days of Pompeii that discussed some of the architecture that was there. And he took a liking to what had been the Palace of Pansa. And he built a model. So at the time, he was part of a group of people who were looking to establish more national parks, both for the cultural heritage, yeah, right, that they protect, and the land heritage, yeah, right, that they protect, but also the opportunity to make money on a grand scale. And he, being influenced probably by his Quaker in-laws, maybe by his grandiose desire to be a superintendent and educator, cough, cough. He wanted to lend to this establishing of national park reclamation an educational component. Now, he had been an avid traveler, as mentioned, And he had enough money to buy things here and there along the way and buy things from people that were coming through St. Augustine. So he had amassed quite a collection of artifacts from around the world. He saw Sarasota Springs in New York as a great place to establish a new central national park. It was a lovely place. It was established as a derby site, a horse racing site. He thought the combination of the area and the horse racing was a perfect place to bring in preservation and educational marketing. So he went up to Sarasota Springs. And he started working with the city council there, the landowners there. Wrote a proposal, had his models and his drawings. And he was able to do it. He was able to, that's the Ponce de Leon Hotel, sorry, I should have been scooting through these. He was able to open what he called Pompeia, which became known as the House of Ponza in 1889. So apparently it was a reconstruction of the Palace of Ponza that had been destroyed in Pompeii, full of his artifacts and collections, bringing high culture to the horse racing crowd. And very profitable, it seems, very profitable as a museum. 60,000 people listed and coming in the first 4 years. It, like many other things, fell by the wayside for a variety of reasons. We'll get to that later. But anyway, while it was running good and bringing him lots of money, which he needed. Now, during his time in St. Augustine, that coincided with James Renwick Jr. also being there under contract with Flagler to rebuild the bell tower at the cathedral. Frankie was doing his advertising thing. He was doing his promoting thing. He was always trying to educate people about his next grand scheme. And it was during that time that he was giving lectures in St. Augustine to the wealthy wintering tourists about his plans to rebuild Washington, D.C., to turn Washington, D.C. into a culmination of all that was great in the ancient world. Now, during this time, as I said, Renwick was there, Shill, constructing the bell tower for the cathedral. And he happened to attend one of these lectures and thought, wow, this guy's a Shill like me. This guy's got it going on. He really liked the idea. He liked the plan. Of course, he liked the money aspect. And so he agreed to collaborate with Smith to help draw up plans, write proposals, and build models. So Renwick was also able to use his connections to help spread this. That became the design prospectus for a National Gallery of History and Art in DC, which you can read. but you'll barf. So I don't recommend that you do, but you can. So in 1891, they had the prospectus prepared and ready and presented it to Congress. But in 1893, we had that depression again, another bank run. Even though there were World's Fairs going on at the time. The country was in a depression. There were World's Fairs going on. Doesn't it make you wonder? The White City was open in 1893. But the banks were closing. Anyway, in 1896, Frankie went to DC to form the National Galleries Company in the old Congressional Globe offices at 339 Pennsylvania Avenue. He had remained in contact with Olmsted, even though he was not welcome in Chicago at the White City. He had remained in contact with Olmsted and Burnham, the man who is listed as being the chief designer for the White City. And he was very influenced by Burnham's City Beautiful movement, as it's called, which is more appropriation and shilling. But anyway, we are told that that had a lot to do with his plans for this DC absurdity with pyramids, no less. Now, there was a gentleman by the name of Samuel Walter Woodward, and he had been one of the founders of the Woodward and Lathrop stores, well known in that area and commonly referred to at the time as Woody's. He had an old property that had been a store. The store had moved out of the property, but he still owned the property. The property had been converted into a roller skating rink. But he still owned the property, and the roller skating rink had moved out, so it was sitting open. And apparently he allowed Smith to get his hands on this property for a song. That's from 1312 to 1315 New York Avenue. To build the prototype. In 1899, he had opened the Halls of the Ancients in the old Lathrop property. Just a couple of years. Cool. What he wanted to do in this first building is he wanted to create a prototype, a sample of the grandeur to come. He wanted to take the best of all the grand temples and the museums across the globe, reproduce them basically in cast plaster, restore them to their original fine state, no damaged pottery or anything like that, and put them together in one place in DC, so that all the finest art and architecture was all in one place, so that Americans would never even desire to go to Europe to learn about art and culture, and that it would be easier for a European to sail across the pond and just visit DC and see all the grandeur instead of having to go from country to country or museum to museum to see different pieces. He wanted to bring everything all together in a big smorgasbord, all in one place. Smith's main connection at the time was Senator Hoare of Massachusetts, who helped him with the distribution of 5,000 copies of his Senate bill that he had proposed with Renwick, proposing this American Acropolis, as it was often referred to. 23 acres, including the old Naval Observatory, which is now the Naval Hospital. 70-foot columns, an Egyptian portal, a Book of the Dead tomb, an Assyrian throne room. Entrance based on the great halls of Karnak. So we had the halls of the ancients open, a little small version of all of that in the old Woodward store in the old roller skating rink. When in 1900, the Institute of American Architects had their yearly convention at the Arlington Hotel. Now, you may remember the Institute of American Architects. I spoke of the formation of that in my video about Richard Upjohn, the Episcopalian shill, not trained architect who is attributed with building churches all over the United States, both wooden and masonry. He started the Institute of American Architects. So in 1900, they had their annual meeting at the Arlington Hotel in DC. Well, here they are, bunch of hacks. Look at all that ego. Holy moly. And I don't know, what is that all over the table? Ferns? What a bunch of horrible human beings. Anyway, needless to say, shills, no shills. And Frankie went to them. They loved the plan. Several of them offered help in design prospectus and influence and education, and we'll help you however we can. So he got support from individual architects as well as the support and endorsement of the organization itself. Now, being a big pamphleteer, educator, hack, he was always writing, distributing. And he put together pamphlets about his stuff to spread around. This was the Hall of the Ancients. This is what we are told was built in the old Woodward building. This being the pilot project for the complete redevelopment of DC. A key part of this development plan was a Parthenon that was supposed to be actually a half scale larger than the standing Parthenon in Greece. And it was to be in celebration of all of the American presidents. 800 feet colonnade stretching along the Potomac, running down to meet up with a gallery of American history. All of this in cast cement, that cast cement stuff that he apparently learned about by exploring old castles in North Africa, that cast cement that he built the Via Zorata from and trained Flagler's architects to build from, which ends up being something that was not requisite of skilled labor and fairly inexpensive by other construction standards. Cast cement. We know about that cement. This was all supposed to be an educational institution investment to teach Americans about European cultural architecture and heritage. Like, boy, you know, that first thing that he did, the fundraiser for the YMCA, really came full circle. Really full circle. There were to be 8 galleries, each representative of one great culture: Egyptian, Assyrian, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, medieval, East Indian, and Saracen. Each gallery, 600 square feet, each with a central court with galleries of 3 parallel corridors for paintings. The central one lighted above, like the Louvre. 1,700 square feet of display space in each, heated by steam. The best poured concrete at the time was looking at 31,000 and change per 100 feet, or $1 million per gallery. His proposal that he wrote with Renwick asked that the government would build the first 1 or 2, and then postulated that men of means would see the grandeur and the success and the potential, and that they would come in and fund the rest of the constructions to be built as memorials to themselves, as well as cultural icons. Now, during all of this grandeur, we don't know exactly when, but during all of this peacock fluffing, his wife Laura left him and went back to France, where apparently there was a family home. Just keep that in mind. Now, Smith apparently was less concerned with the purity of the art than he was with what he considered a patriotic education. So he left the filling of the galleries to all of his wealthy connoisseur friends who had collected works along the way. And he focused on the building of the galleries and the organizing of them into a patriotic message. So he was not a fan of what was considered as the great works of art or gatherings of art according to artist or school or theme. He was also not interested in anything that wasn't perfect. So, you know, if you go to a museum, you'll see some beautiful old thing that's chipped or damaged or put back together in some way. He didn't want any of that. He didn't want anything chipped. He wanted everything to be perfect. The halls that connected the galleries, he wanted filled with 6 to 8 foot paintings of historical American battle scenes. The side corridors between the galleries were to display cast models of statuary, architectural models, and domestic furnishings and housewares and things of the time. Now, again, he only wanted things that were perfect, but he wanted their historical significance. And I think I'm going to sneeze here, excuse me. So what he started doing was reaching out as best he could. Now realize he'd lost a lot of his contacts when Laura left him. He'd lost that whole arm, potentially, of the well-to-do Quaker reformer group. You know, he lost a lot of contacts, but he had gained all the contacts from the Institute of American Architects and Renwick's team and any of the Washington, D.C. connections that he had gained. But so anyway, he wanted to basically have his connoisseur friends and associates ransack the greatness of the European galleries so that he could cast them and put them in his American Acropolis. And in his proposal, he spoke about how this was such a great thing to do at a time when there were still people trying to reorganize themselves after boom, boom, to depressive periods, that he would be able to set up these workshops where items were being cast and reproduced, paintings reproduced, all these items reproduced. Also, that would turn into an opportunity to train educators in the galleries, as well as build an educational programs in arts and culture for the schools. Such a humble man. Such a humble man. In his Greek and Roman courts, for instance, he would have full-size agora and senate houses, Trajan's Column, the Porta Maggiore, and the Palace of Cereus, Temple of Jupiter from Pompeii, catacombs, tombs, and a home from the Appian Way. All of this construction would employ all of these workers, some of them skilled, some of them not. He would put so many people back to work. He proposed building a new Centennial Avenue, 200 feet wide, connecting the Parthenon that he wanted to build to honor the American presidents to the Capitol building. Lushly landscaped, he'd already worked it all out with Olmsted. Porticos to be built between the roadways with solaria above. He wanted to redevelop Pennsylvania Avenue completely, including condemning and removing any building that he found unacceptable. Build colonnades 20 feet wide that would protect pedestrians from rain and sun. And then place a copy of Brandenburg Gate in front of the Capitol, dedicated to his friend, Abraham Lincoln. Now, at the time, there were different railroad stations for the different lines. If I understand it correctly, there were 2, maybe 3 different railroad stations in DC. Now there's just the one Union Station. But at the time, there were 2 or 3. Supposedly, he's the first guy that came up with the idea to bring them all together into one station, which of course is a huge undertaking. Now we get into the work of Flagler and unifying the rails, but that's another story. He wanted to build a new one where all the trains could meet, a central railroad station with Trajan's Column, a column of peace, and a central plaza. That was part of his plan. Just a side note, the current Union Station opened, we are told, in 1907, and is supposed to have been built, cough, cough, by Burnham. Burnham, the guy who is supposed to have built, not built, but been the lead designer for the White City. Cough, cough. 16th Street was to be broadened and renamed into Executive Avenue. The White House to be transformed into a national shrine, and a new one built, modeled after the Palace of Versailles, that would include on the grounds mansions and extensive gardens, hello Olmsted, so that celebrities, dignitaries, and other politicians would have places to stay near the Versailles White House. The Karnak Hall's 70-foot tall columns, 12 feet in diameter, including the Egyptian Hall of Gods and Kings, complete Roman house modeled after a Pompeii house, an Assyrian throne room, casts and slabs of work brought back from Nubia, a reproduction of a Moorish patio from a Tangier's home. He submitted with Renwick plans for the new Corcoran Gallery that included Olmsted landscape architecture. Well, in time that did happen. There is the Renwick Gallery in the Corcoran, and The landscape around it is lovely. I don't know that he ultimately had anything to do with that, but Renwick sure got it done. So what happened with all of this? Well, he built this. This is the old Woodward store, which we're told was a skating rink at one point. This is where the Hall of Ancients stood. His prototype on New York Avenue. These are some of his drawings. What it would have looked like at the end. Apparently, there was some semblance of a movie theater installed at one point, and people attended and saw film before the talkies. That's from one of his pamphlets. Now, grandiose and spectacular. A lot of running around and screaming and yelling. But unfortunately, there was a war going on in the Philippines. And that had kept Congress and Senate very conservative in investments, we are told. Also, unfortunately, his Senate champion, Hoare, from Massachusetts, died in 1904. And any plan of any of this getting out of committee died with him. So that's it. He's an old man now. His wife and kids have left him, don't want to have anything to do with him. He decided to return to Boston. He had some family member that he could stay with. He was broke, he was devastated, he was abandoned. In 1905, the banks foreclosed on his properties in DC. He owned what was inside the Hall of the Ancients, but he didn't own the land it was on. And he couldn't pay the back rent, so he lost everything. It went to auction, and Charles Fairfax of Fairfax County fame purchased the Hall of Ancients in DC and everything that was in it. And for many years, it was a parking garage. In 1906, the banks foreclosed on the St. Augustine and Sarasota Springs properties. So he lost the Villa Zorata. He lost the Pompeia, or House of Ponce, and he lost the Granada. In 1913, an Oriental rug and Egyptian antique dealer by the name of Musam purchased the Villa Zorata at an auction. His family has owned it ever since. In the 1920s, it was converted into a speakeasy and a casino. And after that period in the late 20s, the family moved in. They also bought the Granada Hotel next door, renamed it Alhambra. Its fate was met by a fire, another fire that burned it down in 1954. I don't remember what's there now, to be quite honest. I think there's a bank there. The Hotel Monica, the Casa Monica, knew its heyday from 1888 to 1902. Of course, it had been purchased by Flagler at the end of the first season. He had built a bridge connecting the Hotel Alcazar to the Casa Monica, which he renamed Cordova. And they basically became one hotel at some point. The Depression killed all of that. St. Johns County, which is the county here, claimed what was left of the Casa Monica and turned it into a city building, courthouse, administration center. In 1964, when St. Augustine became infamous for civil rights actions, Martin Luther King was here. Klan came from all over the country to do their damage here, where there were Woodward counter sit-ins and wade-ins in the oceans by Black folk who dared to act like they were human. Swim-ins, Black teenagers jumping into pools in white hotels and daring to act human. We had a Black college here, which you may know from one of my earlier videos. This was a big place in the civil rights movement, and so much so that there was a big police dog flank. And in 1964, the Casa Monica was noted for being a holding center for the police dogs and the officers that maintained them during this period. It remained the county courthouse and administrative building until the 1990s. Now back to the Villa Zorada. In 1903, the family that had moved in, the Muslimam family, decided that the building and what was in it was a little too important. Remember, they had gotten everything that was left in the building as well and decided to convert it into a museum. So they moved out, and it's been a museum ever since. Now, to the Casa Monica, a real estate investor, Richard Kessler, purchased the property from St. Johns County in 1997 and reopened it after restoration in 1999, renamed it the Casa Monica again. There is special note that the flagpole on top of the building is a lightning rod, not a flagpole. We'll leave that right there in terms of ether collection. And Route 411 is supposed to be haunted. Now to Saratoga Springs, the Pompeia building, the House of Panza, was destroyed by a fire, another fire, in 1926. The Shriners in Saratoga Springs apparently bought what was left of the ruin, a song, and used it as their hall for some time. In 2020, Death Wish Coffee bought the building, and it is now their office in Saratoga Springs. And if you go to their website, you'll see that much of apparently what was in the building managed to survive the fire and still stands. This is not anything that Smith is attributed with building or Renwick. This is something in DC. But it all kind of fits in my mind, to the inheritance we're talking about. This is a mysteriously eerie structure in the Arboretum, which is on the east side of the Anacostia River. So east of the main part of DC, northwest, the wrong side of the tracks, the wrong side of the river, the National Arboretum. These columns stand on a wading pool amidst this magnificent arboretum space that is filled with mounds and antiquitech. But now what you're supposed to believe about this, because this is all about believing nonsense, is that these columns were the original columns from the Senate side of the Capitol. And that when the Capitol was reconstructed so that the dome can be added, these columns were considered not structurally stable enough to hold the dome. So you are to believe that the columns were removed in one piece each, put on a barge, moved across the river, hauled, I don't know how, from the river into the Arboretum grounds and re-erected in front of this reflecting pool. That's what you're supposed to believe. That this was not a building, but that these once held up the Senate side of the Capitol. The 1900 census listed Frankie Smith as a widower, even though we know Laura had already left him. And in fact, she didn't die until 1915. She died in France with her family, but was buried in their plot in Cambridge, Massachusetts that was already established. Frankie was disowned by his family, Laura and her family. But there was one older sister who had a property with a small apartment in it or loft or something. And that is where he lived, broke, destroyed, and obscure, passing away in 1911. They're both buried in the family plot in Cambridge. This is my lovely St. Augustine, Castillo San Marcos. Don't know the exact date, but you can see that Anastasia Island is not developed at all. There's the lighthouse. One of the marketing things that Flagler did when he was here running hotels is he turned this ruin of the Castillo San Marcos, all this magnificent sacred geometry, into a golf course. Fascinating. It's interesting too, the Kubo line's not here. The Kubo line would be right there. I am to believe that that's probably Orange Street right there. That's San Marco Avenue. Oh, that great sacred geometry. A lot of this has been lost. If only the water could speak. What has this water, the Matanzas River, seen? It's seen a lot. The water does speak, though. People just have to learn how to understand what it's saying. So there you go. Another reset architect Shill. Pretty amusing. I just wanted to find out a little bit more about the guy who is attributed with building the Via Zarata. And look at the rabbit hole I went down. My goodness. I already have the next rabbit hole offerings coming off of this in mind to start researching. So I'm ending right here, bringing you back to Unguru. Unguru indeed. Become your own authority. Pull away from gurus and leaders, and even people in the truth-telling world who want you to buy their t-shirts and Hi there, Shill. No shills. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Buffy. Thank you, Unguru. Unguru your life, unguru yourself. Become your own critical, discerning, independent, interdependent, discerning individual. Thank you for hanging out with me. That was another long one. Thank you for all the coffees and comments and support and questions. I leave you now on Wednesday, ready to make another cup of coffee. Hope you enjoyed this goofy excursion into the world of reset. This is Joyce at Medusa Was Framed, thanking you very, very, very much. And saying until next time, aloha.